There are stories that do not begin with triumph, but with trembling. Stories that rise not from light, but from the slow awakening of those who once walked in darkness. This is the story of a man who looked into the mirror of his own soul and found a stranger staring back. A man whose power became his prison, whose silence was filled with the screams of the forgotten, and whose redemption was carved from the ashes of his own cruelty. We speak today not of saints or heroes, but of what it means to be human, fragile, flawed, and yet still capable of grace. For every heart that has ever been hardened by pride, and every soul that has ever longed for forgiveness, his journey is our reflection. The plantation stands not simply as a stretch of land where crops grow, but as a psychological kingdom, a mirror of the human soul entangled in the illusion of control. It is a world meticulously arranged by man, cultivated not by nature's freedom but by his will to dominate. Every stalk that rises from its soil is a silent testament to hands that bleed unseen, to backs that bend under suns that do not warm them. The plantation glows in the light of wealth and pride, yet beneath its beauty festers decay, a moral sickness disguised by the perfume of flowers and the glitter of abundance. To the casual eye, it is paradise, an empire of order, prosperity, and harmony. But to those who listen beneath the hum of cicadas and the rustle of sugarcane, there is a different song, a dirge echoing through the roots, where guilt grows stronger than any crop. The air itself seems heavy, as though it remembers every injustice that has seeped into it. The land bears memory, and memory bears judgment, though the master pretends not to hear. The plantation is an illusion, a theater where the powerful perform righteousness while standing on foundations of silent suffering. Its grand mansion, built with pillars of marble and floors polished to a mirror's gleam, is not the home of virtue, but the fortress of denial. The owner walks its corridors believing himself noble, his power justified by birth, by skin, by the laws he wrote in his own favor. Yet every echo of his footsteps is answered by the heartbeat of the enslaved, those whose lives he has turned into instruments of his comfort. The plantation thrives because the truth is buried beneath it. Its fields are watered with silence, and its beauty exists because others have been forbidden to speak. This false harmony is the seed of its decay, for no structure, no empire, no soul can remain whole when built upon the bones of others. The plantation becomes a metaphor for the human psyche that refuses to confront its own darkness. It is the externalization of the mind's denial, the ego's desperate attempt to maintain order while repression rots beneath. The owner sees only the surface, straight rows, healthy plants, shining wealth. He does not see the soil growing darker with every unacknowledged cruelty, with every scream swallowed by night. In his mind, the plantation is a success story, a triumph of civilization over chaos. Yet the more he perfects its outer order, the more it mirrors the chaos he hides within. Every act of domination outside reflects the corruption inside, every lash of the whip an echo of his own fragmented soul. The plantation does not merely exploit bodies, it consumes spirits. The enslaved do not just harvest crops, they harvest the master's delusion. Their labor sustains his identity, his sense of power, his fragile illusion that he is godlike, chosen, superior. But power that feeds on pain is parasitic. It grows, yes, but like a tumor. The plantation thus becomes a living organism of hypocrisy, alive with movement, yet dying from within. Its beauty is a mask stretched tight over decomposition. Even the winds that move through its trees seem to whisper secrets too ancient to silence. The birds that sing above its fields carry songs that mourn rather than celebrate. Nature itself becomes complicit and weary, carrying the weight of man's arrogance. In this grand illusion of prosperity, the master confuses control with creation. He mistakes obedience for harmony and silence for peace. He builds fences not just around his land, but around his conscience. Yet in his pursuit to dominate the outer world, he loses mastery of his inner one. The plantation mirrors this internal loss, the loss of empathy, of humility, of the capacity to see beyond one's own reflection. He becomes trapped within the very system he created, chained not by iron but by delusion. The plantation becomes his gilded cage, a kingdom where he reigns over everyone but himself. Over time, the plantation begins to change. The crops still grow, but their abundance feels hollow. The harvest becomes routine, the sunlight harsher, the silence thicker. The master's laughter echoes through empty halls, and his wealth multiplies even as his soul diminishes. His daughter grows up within these walls, surrounded by plenty, but starved of truth. She plays among flowers rooted in suffering, eats fruit nourished by sorrow, and breathes air heavy with unspoken guilt. The plantation raises her not as an individual, but as an inheritance. She becomes the embodiment of the system's continuity. In her innocence, she does not yet know that her comfort is another's torment, that her luxury is built upon chains she has never seen. She smiles with the purity of one who has not yet understood the price of her world, yet even in her laughter, the plantation hums with unease, as if aware that innocence cannot last forever in the house of corruption. As years pass, the plantation begins to resemble its owner, proud, isolated, and decaying beneath its grandeur. The walls absorb the whispers of cruelty until even the furniture seems haunted. The land itself becomes restless, its fertility turning grotesque, its beauty oppressive. It is as though the earth itself wishes to purge the poison of man's ego. Rain no longer feels like blessing, but like washing, an attempt by the heavens to cleanse what has been defiled. The trees bend in strange silence, the animals grow wary, and the night grows heavier, thick with the sense that something unseen is waiting. The plantation begins to dream of its own destruction. What was once a symbol of civilization now stands as a monument to denial. It reflects not progress but corruption, not order but repression. The master, who once saw himself as the creator of this paradise, now walks through it as a ghost unaware of his death. His wealth isolates him, his authority imprisons him. He cannot hear the whispers of conscience because he has surrounded himself with silence. The plantation's perfection becomes unbearable, its order suffocating. Every neatly aligned crop is a reminder of those forced to align their lives to his command. Every wall of his mansion is both shield and accusation, protecting him from truth, yet enclosing him in lies. And yet, the plantation endures, not because it is strong, but because it is blind. Its endurance is the endurance of ignorance, not of virtue. It survives by feeding on denial, by refusing to acknowledge the rot that sustains it. But beneath every illusion lies truth, and truth, though buried, does not die. It waits. It gathers weight in the soil, in the hearts of the oppressed, in the dreams of those who suffer. One day it will rise, not as revenge, but as revelation. When it does, the plantation will collapse, not through violence, but through awakening. Its decay will not come from outside forces, but from the realization that it has never been alive in spirit. Thus, the plantation becomes the ultimate symbol of moral decay, a place where beauty grows from blood, where order hides oppression, where the light of civilization blinds itself to the darkness it creates. It teaches that when power loses empathy, it begins to rot. When wealth loses conscience, it begins to corrode. It teaches that when power loses empathy, it begins to rot. When wealth loses conscience, it begins to corrode. The plantation's grandeur is the facade of a diseased heart, and its productivity is the fever of a soul trying to disguise its sickness through motion. Every act of labor beneath its sun is a ritual of denial, every harvest a repetition of guilt. The moral decay it represents is not loud or sudden, but slow and silent, a corruption that becomes normal, accepted, even celebrated. The plantation, in its quiet tyranny, shows how evil rarely appears monstrous. It often hides behind manners, routines, and the illusion of order. The owner believes himself civilized because his cruelty is clean, structured, and lawful. He does not see the moral maggots beneath his polished world. His blindness becomes his damnation, for what he refuses to see will one day rise to see him. The plantation, like his soul, will collapse under the weight of its own denial. Its fall will not be merely physical, it will be spiritual, a collapse of meaning, a reckoning between illusion and truth. In the end, the plantation is not just a place in history, but a condition of the human mind. It exists wherever comfort is built upon suffering, wherever wealth blinds compassion, wherever order silences truth. It is the garden of humanity's self-deception, the monument of our arrogance. Its soil grows not crops, but conscience, hidden, buried, waiting to bloom in judgment. And when that conscience finally awakens, when the voices once silenced begin to speak, the plantation, and all that it symbolizes, will. The daughter's existence within the plantation is a quiet tragedy disguised as privilege, a life born not out of innocence, but out of inheritance. She grows beneath ceilings that glitter with chandeliers, yet echo with ghosts, surrounded by walls that hum with unspoken guilt. Her cradle is carved from the same wood that built the master's throne, and her lullabies are sung in the trembling voices of those who serve her. She breathes the perfumed air of the plantation, yet every fragrance hides decay. Every petal she touches blooms from poisoned soil. Her beauty, her laughter, her abundance are not her own. They are the reflections of a world that feeds her with what it has stolen from others. She is not guilty of the crimes of her father, yet she carries them in her flesh. Her comfort is an inheritance of cruelty, her peace a legacy of silence. From the moment she is born, her life becomes the embodiment of moral debt unpaid, the living continuation of a sin her soul never chose but must inevitably bear. The daughter moves through the mansion like a ghost of innocence haunting a kingdom of guilt. The servants bow, the halls shimmer, and her father's eyes soften with pride when she enters. Yet even in her presence there is unease, as if the walls themselves remember too much. She is adored not for who she is, but for what she represents, the continuation of a name, a system, an illusion of eternal power. Her father sees in her the preservation of his world. She is his legacy made flesh, the heir to his dominance. But within her heart, beneath layers of unawareness, something ancient stirs, a quiet unease, a heaviness that cannot be named. It is not her body alone that grows in size and fullness, it is the weight of everything she unconsciously carries. Each meal, each comfort, each act of pampering becomes symbolic of indulgence that the world around her cannot afford. Her body becomes an archive, a vessel into which generations of greed, indulgence, and denial are poured. She grows not simply in flesh, but in burden, as though her body itself refuses to remain untouched by the sins that surround it. There is a strange sadness in her laughter, though she does not understand why. The gardens that stretch beyond her window seem endless, but when she looks upon them, she feels an invisible boundary, a horizon that separates her from something she cannot name. She has never seen the fields where the enslaved labor from dawn to dusk. She has never touched the soil that sustains her table. Yet somehow she feels its pull, as if her soul recognizes what her mind has never been allowed to witness. Sometimes she wakes in the night with a heaviness in her chest, a dream of hands reaching from the earth, not to harm her, but to remind her of a debt unpaid. She is haunted not by ghosts of violence, but by the silence of truth withheld. The air she breathes carries the residue of centuries of pain, and though she does not know its source, she feels its weight pressing upon her, shaping her thoughts, her emotions, even her body. Her father, proud of his empire, teaches her to see the world as divided, those who rule and those who serve, those chosen by fate and those condemned by it. She nods and smiles, but somewhere inside her, something resists. There are moments when she looks into the eyes of a servant and sees a flicker of something too human, too equal, to ignore. That fleeting recognition terrifies her, for it shakes the foundation of everything she has been taught. Her world depends on not seeing, not feeling, not knowing. Yet she feels, even when she tries not to. Her heart beats in empathy she cannot explain, her mind rebels in silence, and her soul bears the pain of awareness that her upbringing forbids. As she grows older, her body begins to change, not with the gentle bloom of youth, but with the heavy accumulation of unspoken emotion. The more she eats, the more she indulges, the more she tries to fill the void inside her, the more her body reflects the spiritual burden she carries. She does not hunger for food, but for something deeper, meaning, connection, release. Yet in the world of the plantation, no one speaks of such things. Her father celebrates her size as a sign of wealth. Her mother praises her beauty as divine favor, but beneath their admiration lies denial. Her body becomes the mirror of the world around her, overfed but undernourished, adorned but aching, full yet empty. She becomes the visible symptom of an invisible disease. The plantation's moral decay, which her father hides beneath wealth and authority, manifests in her flesh, as if her body refuses to lie. There are moments when she feels trapped inside herself, when her reflection in the mirror seems not her own. Her face glows with innocence, yet her eyes betray a sorrow too deep for her years. She wonders sometimes if her heaviness is a punishment or a message. If perhaps her body has become the language through which the truth of her world speaks. When she walks through the halls, her footsteps echo like confessions unspoken. The house creaks as though tired of its secrets. The mirrors seem to look back at her with quiet accusation. In her isolation, she begins to sense that her life is not truly hers, that she has inherited more than wealth. She has inherited a legacy of silence, a wound passed from generation to generation, dressed in silk and called civilization. The plantation workers look at her with a mixture of pity and restraint. They see in her both oppressor and victim. She is their master's daughter, yet she is also trapped, bound by ignorance rather than chains. They know something she does not, that innocence in such a place is impossible, that even unknowing hearts can be guilty through their silence. Some whisper that the child carries the weight of her father's sins in her body, that her flesh remembers what her mind refuses to see. To them, she is both curse and prophecy, a sign that the master's house will one day collapse under its own guilt. She grows into womanhood surrounded by luxury but starving for truth. Her world is soft and perfumed, yet inside her is a storm. She does not yet know that she embodies the conflict of two worlds, the world of illusion that raised her and the world of truth buried beneath it. Her body becomes the battlefield upon which these two forces wage war. The plantation's silence, its repressed history, its hidden cruelty, all find expression in her. She becomes the living confession of the empire's sin. Her obesity is not gluttony, but grief made flesh, the soul's cry for release in a world that forbids such cries. There are nights when she stands by her window, looking at the endless darkness beyond the fields. She imagines what lies out there, beyond her comfort, beyond her ignorance. Sometimes she sees faint movements, figures in the distance, torches glowing, shadows bending under the moon. She feels a pull, a strange desire to step outside, to walk barefoot on the soil her world has forbidden her to touch. She feels that if she could only touch it, perhaps she would understand, perhaps she would be free. Yet she never moves, for fear, shame, and obedience hold her fast. Her father's love is her prison, his pride her chain. Her life becomes a quiet waiting, though she does not know what she waits for. The plantation begins to tremble under the weight of its own guilt, and she too begins to sense that something within her must break. She dreams of fire sometimes, of the house burning, of herself walking through the flames unscathed. She dreams of rivers washing her clean, of voices whispering forgiveness. But when she wakes, she finds herself in the same room, the same silence, the same body that refuses to forget. She becomes both the symptom and the prophecy of the plantation's end, the innocent inheritor of a sin too vast to conceal, the vessel through which truth will demand to be seen. Her tragedy is not that she is evil, but that she is the mirror of evil unacknowledged. She carries in her every indulgence the memory of suffering she has never witnessed. She is loved yet unloved, free yet imprisoned, pure yet polluted by a history she did not choose. She is the embodiment of generational blindness, the living testimony of how innocence, when raised in denial, becomes guilt without ever committing a crime. Her body, her breath, her being, all are haunted by what the world around her refuses to face. And though she does not yet know it, her life is destined to become the turning point in a story far greater than herself. The moment when illusion confronts truth, when innocence meets its shadow, when the sins of the fathers finally find their reflection in the child who carries their name. The slave exists not as a single man within the plantation, but as the collective embodiment of all that the master's world refuses to see. He is the living shadow cast by the blinding light of privilege, the dark reflection of every act of domination, the conscience buried alive beneath the mansion's marble floors. His body bears the marks of chains, but his soul holds something older and more enduring. The truth that cannot be destroyed by oppression, only hidden from the eyes of those who fear it. In him resides the pain, the endurance, and the suppressed dignity of generations. He is the unspoken memory of what has been denied, the part of humanity that civilization calls uncivilized, only to silence its own guilt. Within the intricate machinery of the plantation, he moves like a ghost who sustains the world of the living, while being treated as if he were already dead. Yet even in his silence, there is a presence that unsettles the very air. For what is repressed does not vanish. It waits, it deepens, it learns the language of patience. The slave is the mirror of the master's soul, the vessel through which the true cost of power is revealed. Every command the master utters, every lash, every order, is echoed within the slave's body as an imprint of the master's inner corruption. In Jungian terms, he is the shadow self made flesh, the dark twin of the master's mind, carrying everything that the conscious ego refuses to claim. The master, believing himself pure and superior, expels his own moral filth onto the body of the oppressed, projecting into him all the guilt, fear, and rage that he dares not face within himself. The slave becomes the repository of this psychic waste, the silent bearer of his master's unacknowledged darkness. Thus he is hated not for what he is, but for what he reflects. The master sees in him the humanity he has lost, the conscience he has strangled, the vulnerability he has buried. To destroy the slave would be to silence that reflection, to kill the witness of his own decay. Yet that reflection cannot be killed. It returns in dreams, in guilt, in the restless stirring of the night. The slave's very existence becomes a haunting, a constant reminder that power built on denial is a house built on trembling ground. His silence is not emptiness but resistance. Beneath his stillness lies a storm, the kind of storm that does not roar but accumulates, gathering strength in secret. He speaks rarely because his world has no ears for his truth, but every word he does not say becomes a stone in the foundation of reckoning. His restraint is not submission, it is observation. He sees what the master cannot, the fragility behind arrogance, the loneliness behind cruelty, the decay behind wealth. His suffering gives him vision, a kind of dark wisdom that those who live in comfort will never know. He is forced into invisibility, but invisibility sharpens perception. He learns to read faces, gestures, tones, silences. He becomes a master of seeing what others refuse to see, of understanding the unspoken. He lives beneath power, yet perceives it more clearly than those who wield it. The plantation system depends on his blindness, but he is the only one who truly sees. The slave's existence transforms the plantation into a moral theater. Every act of labor becomes an act of endurance, every command an experiment in how far the human soul can stretch without breaking. Yet beneath that endurance lies a profound, unspoken question. How long can truth be buried before it forces itself to the surface? The master may own the body, but he cannot own the meaning of suffering. Pain becomes the slave's hidden scripture, his silent communion with all who have ever been silenced. Within that pain is a strange purity, a fire that refines rather than consumes. It becomes a force that connects him to something eternal, the raw, uncorrupted essence of human dignity. The master believes himself divine, yet it is the slave who touches divinity through endurance, who bears the crucifix of history with grace too deep to be understood by those who inflict it. To the eyes of the world, the slave appears powerless, yet he possesses a power far greater than his master's, the power of truth. The master's authority depends on illusion, the illusion of superiority, the illusion that cruelty is order, that injustice is natural. The slave's suffering shatters these illusions, even if quietly, for it reveals the falseness at their core. His very existence exposes the hypocrisy of a system that calls itself civilized while feeding on barbarity. His wounds become living evidence, his scars the unspoken testimony of a moral crime. And though his voice is silenced, his presence itself becomes a kind of language, one that speaks through stillness, through eyes that do not bow, through the persistence of spirit that refuses annihilation. His silence becomes louder than any speech, his humility more accusatory than any rebellion. There are moments, perhaps in the cool of night when the plantation sleeps, when the slave feels the stirrings of something vast and ineffable within him, a knowledge that he is not merely a victim, but the keeper of a truth too powerful for his oppressors to bear. He feels that the pain of his people is not meaningless, but sacred, that their suffering is the crucible through which the soul of humanity is being forged anew. He knows, even if dimly, that every chain eventually becomes a symbol, that every act of oppression plants the seed of its own undoing. His endurance becomes prophecy, his survival an indictment of the very system meant to erase him. In this way, he becomes the conscience of the plantation, the living heart that beats beneath its glittering corpse. The master fears the slave not for his strength, but for his stillness. There is something in that silence that cannot be controlled. It is as if the slave carries within him a secret knowledge, that power is temporary, that guilt is eternal, that truth, though buried, cannot be forgotten. When the master looks into the eyes of the slave, he glimpses that knowledge and turns away, for to confront it would be to face his own moral death. The plantation's order depends on never meeting that gaze, on never acknowledging the humanity that looks back. Thus, the entire structure of domination becomes a ritual of avoidance, a desperate attempt to suppress the unbearable recognition that the one enslaved is not less than human but more, a mirror of purity reflecting the master's corruption. The master builds his world upon the illusion of difference, yet that illusion collapses the moment he dares to truly see. In the deeper symbolic sense, the slave becomes the repository of the world's forgotten soul. He carries within him the memory of what humanity once was, before greed corrupted its spirit. His suffering reconnects him to the elemental truths that power has abandoned, the simplicity of breath, the sacredness of endurance, the communion of all living beings. His songs, whispered in the night, are not just laments, but prayers that reach beyond the walls of the plantation, touching something eternal. Through him, the buried conscience of the world continues to speak. He is the voice of the earth itself, crying beneath the weight of false empires, waiting for the day when truth will rise from the soil and demand to be seen. In dreams, the slave sometimes sees the mansion crumbling, its marble cracking under invisible pressure. He does not know whether it is prophecy or wish, but he senses that the day will come when what is hidden will be revealed, when those who live in light will be forced to face the shadow they have denied. He feels it in the tremor of the earth, in the restlessness of the wind, in the unease of the animals that roam the fields. The world itself seems to conspire with his endurance, as if nature too has grown weary of lies. Though his body remains bound, his spirit begins to expand, touching dimensions that no chain can hold. His existence becomes a form of resistance deeper than rebellion, the quiet persistence of truth within the heart of falsehood. In this symbolic world, the slave is not merely a character but an archetype, the shadow that exists within every human heart. Each of us, like the master, carries within ourselves a part we wish not to see, the sum of all our guilt, fear, and cruelty. The slave is that part externalized, made visible through suffering. To deny him is to deny ourselves. To acknowledge him is to begin healing. The story of the plantation is therefore not merely a tale of historical oppression, but of inner psychology, the eternal struggle between the light of self-image and the darkness of truth. The slave reminds us that freedom cannot be achieved by denying the shadow, but by embracing and integrating it, by recognizing the humanity in what we have dehumanized. Thus, the slave stands as the moral and spiritual center of the plantation's world, unseen, unthanked, unfree, yet holding the only form of freedom that truly matters, the freedom of inner truth. His suffering is not defeat but revelation, his silence not emptiness but prophecy. In him, the buried conscience of mankind breathes, waiting for the moment when the master's world collapses under its own denial, and the truth, long repressed, rises from beneath the soil like dawn breaking through centuries of night. The night on the plantation was thick, not just with heat, but with the weight of something unseen, something that clung to the air like an unspoken truth. The father, once a man of command, whose words carried the certainty of law and the arrogance of ownership, found himself suffocating under the silence of his own creation. The fields stretched endlessly before him, dark and heavy with the scent of soil and sweat. Yet what haunted him was not the land, but the echo of his own choices. His wealth had been built on the backs of those who had no names in his eyes, their humanity stripped and traded for labor, their cries muffled by the rhythm of profit. Yet now, for the first time, he heard those cries without the filter of power, and they reverberated in his mind like a dirge that no prayer could silence. The horror that gripped him was not born of something he saw, but of something he finally understood, the collapse of a lie he had lived within for too long. He had believed himself a god of his domain, a master shaping order from chaos, but the illusion had begun to rot from within. The walls of his house, once symbols of pride, now seemed to sweat with the memories of injustice. Every creak of the wood was an accusation, every flicker of the candle a face that refused to be forgotten. He began to feel the air pressing upon him as though the very world he had built was turning against him. His conscience, long buried under the comforts of hierarchy and entitlement, stirred like something ancient waking from sleep. It was not a gentle awakening. It was violent, invasive, like the earth cracking open to release the stench of decay. His mind became a battlefield between denial and realization, and his heart, once so sure of its righteousness, trembled beneath the weight of truth. He tried to rationalize it at first, to convince himself that order demanded sacrifice, that his power was part of the natural order of things. But the deeper he searched for justification, the more he uncovered the stench of moral rot. The plantation that had once represented stability now revealed itself as a monument to his blindness. The chains, the cries, the silence, all of it came rushing back like a storm breaking through a dam. What he felt was not simply guilt, it was a profound sense of dislocation, as though his soul had been ripped from the illusion of control and thrown naked into the chaos of truth. For the first time, he saw himself not as a master, but as a prisoner, bound to the machinery of his own cruelty, enslaved by the system he believed he commanded. The horror took shape not in external form, but in reflection. When he looked into the mirror, the face that stared back at him was not his own. The eyes were hollow, rimmed with sleepless regret, the mouth twisted in something between disbelief and dread. The image of his own daughter haunted him as well, not because of what she represented outwardly, but because she was the living mirror of his corruption, the innocent born into guilt, the vessel carrying the weight of his sins. In her he saw not purity but inheritance, an unchosen legacy of moral blindness. It was this realization that tore through the last layer of his composure. He understood then that evil was not an act, it was a seed, passed down quietly, disguised as culture, as pride, as necessity. And in that moment he recognized that he had been nurturing it his entire life. The house around him seemed to transform as his awareness deepened. The grand staircase that once signified prestige now felt like a descent into madness. The portraits of his ancestors appeared to leer at him, their painted eyes gleaming with cold indifference. Even the wind outside seemed to carry whispers, voices that spoke of justice, of retribution, of balance long denied. The plantation's stillness became unbearable, for it was no longer silence, it was the sound of judgment, stretched thin across every wall, every field, every memory. His hands trembled as he touched the window pane, feeling the night air seep in through the cracks, as if the world itself was breathing against his guilt. His mind wandered to the concept of ownership, a word that had once given him identity. He realized how absurd it was to believe that one human could own another, that flesh and soul could be reduced to property. The horror lay in the recognition that his power had been a delusion, a fragile construct upheld by collective denial. The true chains were invisible, the ones around his conscience, forged by generations of moral blindness. He was not free. He had never been free. His wealth, his pride, his legacy, all of it had been built upon enslavement of the body, and worse, enslavement of the spirit. He began to understand that the greatest punishment was not death or ruin, it was awakening. To awaken was to feel every suppressed scream, every ignored injustice, every buried truth surge back into consciousness. He stumbled through the corridors of his home like a ghost searching for release. The walls seemed to pulse with life, breathing reminders of what he had chosen not to see. He felt the presence of those who had once lived and died under his command, not as spirits of vengeance, but as echoes of his own fragmented soul. They were not haunting him, they were him, the collective conscience he had severed from his humanity. The plantation, once an extension of his pride, had become an external manifestation of his inner hell, a landscape of spiritual desolation. The crops that grew in the fields seemed to whisper accusations with every rustle of the wind, each leaf a testimony to the suffering that had fed the soil. As dawn approached, he stepped outside, drawn by some instinct he could not name. The horizon was a faint band of light struggling to pierce the darkness, and in that fragile glow, he felt both hope and despair. The world looked the same, yet everything within him had changed. The sun's rise did not bring peace but revelation. It cast light on the ruins of illusion. He saw the plantation for what it truly was, a monument to the blindness of man, the arrogance of those who mistake control for righteousness. His heart felt heavy with something unnameable, a grief that was both personal and universal, the mourning of innocence lost and truth gained too late. The horror that once paralyzed him began to shift, not disappearing but transforming into something else, a seed of understanding. He realized that conscience, once awakened, cannot be silenced again. It grows, relentless and demanding, pushing the soul toward redemption or madness. He did not yet know which would claim him, but he understood that his horror was not punishment, it was rebirth. To feel deeply, painfully, was to be human again. The walls of denial had cracked, and though the ruin they revealed was unbearable, it was also honest. In his torment, he discovered a strange form of grace, the grace of knowing that truth, however cruel, is the only thing that can cleanse. And so he stood there, motionless, as the first full light of morning fell upon the fields. The plantation shimmered in gold, beautiful and damning all at once. The father's eyes filled with tears he could no longer hold back. The land that had once obeyed him now judged him, and he accepted that judgment with a trembling heart. His horror had become his teacher, his conscience the voice he had silenced for too long. In the stillness of that awakening, he finally saw himself as he truly was, not a master of others, but a servant to truth. And though the path ahead promised no peace, it was at least real, and for the first time in his life, so was he. The days that followed his awakening did not bring relief. They brought silence, a silence so profound it felt alive, as though the air itself withheld its breath in mourning. The father walked through his world as if through a dream unraveling, each familiar object stripped of its innocence, every wall whispering what he had refused to hear. The sunlight that once poured through his windows now seemed like judgment, not warmth. The laughter of the distant workers, the rustle of trees, the creak of the wooden floors, each sound carried the weight of a conscience no longer sleeping. Horror had not left him, it had merely changed form. It was no longer an intruder, but a presence that shadowed him, silent yet relentless. And yet beneath that agony, something had begun to stir, something small, fragile, and unbearably human. It was not forgiveness, not peace, but awareness, and awareness, he understood, was the beginning of all redemption. He began to see the world differently, as if the veil between illusion and truth had been torn away. The things he once loved appeared to him now as they truly were, tainted by neglect, built upon suffering, maintained through denial. And yet he did not turn away. The man who had once commanded others to obey now bowed before the enormity of his own blindness. He began to work alongside those he had wronged, his hands trembling, not from weakness but from the shock of humility. Each gesture, each word became an act of repentance, though he knew it could never undo what had been done. Still he persisted, for redemption, he sensed, was not a matter of erasing sin, but of learning to carry its weight with honesty. The fields around him, long symbols of his dominion, became instead the mirrors of his struggle. Where he once saw profit, he now saw history, his history written in the soil. And as he labored beneath the sun, the sweat that fell from his brow mingled with the earth like a baptism in sorrow. Nights were the hardest. The silence of darkness brought his memories closer, and the faces of those he had wronged returned to him, not in anger, but in remembrance. Their eyes were not vengeful. They were weary, eternal, and forgiving in a way that tore at him more deeply than hatred ever could. He would wake from dreams drenched in tears, his heart aching not for himself, but for what he had made of others. And yet within that pain, there was a strange tenderness, as if the act of feeling deeply for the first time was a kind of resurrection. He began to understand that true redemption is not a triumph but a surrender, not the restoration of pride, but the breaking of it. Horror had been his punishment, but it was also his guide, leading him through the labyrinth of his own soul toward a fragile kind of light. He came to see that the world was full of wounds, wounds that he had contributed to, wounds that echoed across generations. He no longer sought to be forgiven by others, he sought instead to become worthy of forgiveness. Each act of kindness, each quiet apology, was a step on a path that had no end. There was no absolution waiting at the horizon, no grand redemption song, only the daily effort to live truthfully, to honor the suffering that had awakened him. He began to give away what he owned, not as charity, but as atonement. He listened to the stories of those who had once been invisible to him, their voices trembling yet steady, their dignity shining through the cracks of memory. The more he listened, the smaller he became in his own eyes, and the smaller he became, the closer he felt to something sacred. He understood then that horror and redemption are not opposites, but reflections of the same truth. Horror reveals what we are capable of when we forget our humanity. Redemption begins when we remember. And to remember is to suffer, for memory is not gentle, it is a fire that burns away illusion. He no longer fled from that fire. He let it consume his pride, his vanity, his certainty. Each time it burned him, he felt a little freer. Pain became his teacher, silence his confessor, and humility his only prayer. The world around him remained scarred, but within those scars he began to see beauty, the beauty of what endures, of what heals slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. Seasons passed, and with them the years. His hair turned white, his hands roughened with age, and yet the weight upon his heart did not fade. He no longer expected it to. Redemption, he learned, is not about being cleansed of sin, it is about learning to live with it in truth. The world does not erase what was done, it transforms it through awareness. The soil still bore the memory of suffering, but in that same soil, new life grew. Children played where once there had been sorrow, their laughter fragile but real. And as he watched them, he felt something within him ease, not because the past was gone, but because it was finally being acknowledged. The silence that once haunted him had softened into stillness, and that stillness, though laced with grief, was alive with understanding. He knew he would die with his guilt intact, but he no longer feared it. Guilt, after all, was the shadow of conscience, and conscience was the last proof of his humanity. What terrified him once now sustained him, for in his remorse he had found his soul again. Redemption had not saved him, it had changed him. It had stripped him of everything he once valued, leaving only the raw, unguarded truth of being. That truth was sorrowful, but it was also luminous. He had learned that love is born not from innocence, but from the courage to face one's own darkness and still choose compassion. His life had been a tragedy of pride, but in its ending, it had become a testament to awareness. On his final morning, he stood once more before the land that had witnessed his transformation. The sun rose slowly, washing the horizon in a quiet light that seemed neither forgiving nor condemning. It simply was. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth on his face, and in that moment he did not seek to be absolved. He sought only to belong to the truth he had spent his life denying. The earth beneath his feet felt alive, pulsing with memory, and he whispered a silent vow, not of faith, but of responsibility. The world, he realized, does not grant redemption to the unrepentant, nor does it deny it to the broken. It only reflects what we bring to it, and as he breathed his last, the horror that had once consumed him dissolved into something else, not peace, not joy, but a quiet acceptance, the still heartbeat of Red Tor. After his passing, the house stood in silence, not the silence of abandonment, but the kind that breathes, a silence that listens, absorbs, and transforms. The walls that had once echoed with command now stood as mute witnesses to something unspoken, a slow unraveling of the darkness that had long claimed them. The fields, too, seemed changed. The air no longer carried the same weight of fear, but neither did it forget. It was as though the earth itself mourned and remembered all at once, its sighs heavy with both sorrow and renewal. The man's death did not end his story. It released it, spreading through the land like a faint tremor of conscience. Those who remained felt it, though few could name it. It was not redemption in full bloom, it was the seed of it, fragile and buried deep, waiting beneath the soil of memory. The people who had once labored under his rule began to move differently, not out of obedience, but out of awareness. They spoke softly of the man who had changed in his final years, who had set down his pride and lifted instead the burdens he had imposed. Some forgave him, others did not, but all felt the weight of his transformation. It lingered in the air, unsettling and unresolved, like a question that refused to die. The plantation no longer thrived as it once had. Profit faded and ambition quieted, yet something else grew in its place, a strange kind of stillness, an uneasy peace. The land itself seemed to sigh, as if exhausted by generations of cruelty and now resting, unsure whether to heal or to weep. In the towns nearby, whispers of his final days spread like faint ripples in stagnant water. People spoke of how he had lived among those he once ruled, how he had worked beside them, how he had given away what he owned without demand for gratitude. To some, he was a fool who had gone mad with guilt. To others, he was a man who had finally seen. But what mattered most was not what they believed of him. It was that they began to think at all. Questions once buried beneath convenience began to surface. What does power mean if it costs one's soul? What kind of wealth is built on the ruin of another's life? The answers did not come easily, nor did they come kindly, but they came nonetheless. In that collective unease, the world began to shift, imperceptibly at first, like a great tide drawing back before its return. The generation that followed did not know him, yet they inherited his shadow. The house remained, worn and hollow, a monument to both cruelty and repentance. Nature began to reclaim it. Vines crept up the walls, the roof sagged under time, and the air grew sweet with decay. Yet in that decay, there was life. New roots tangled where once there were chains, birds nested in the eaves where once hung banners of dominance. It was as though the earth itself had chosen to forgive what man could not, covering the remnants of pride with the quiet persistence of renewal. The world outside remained harsh, still ruled by greed and indifference, yet here and there, small acts of compassion flickered like stars in a sky not yet ready for dawn. Humanity as a whole did not transform overnight. It rarely does. The machinery of power continued to grind, indifferent and vast. But within its turning gears, the faint pulse of conscience had begun to beat again. People began to feel what he had felt, the disquiet of inherited guilt, the stirring of buried empathy. The horror he had faced alone had become a mirror held up to the collective soul. It was a painful awakening, for to see clearly is to suffer deeply. But out of that suffering came a kind of light, not bright, not pure, but real. The world began to sense that redemption was not a gift from heaven, but a labor of the heart, paid for in awareness and humility. There were those who rejected this awakening, who clung to comfort and denial, who spoke of progress while ignoring its cost. But even their denial was proof of the change. The world could no longer be blind in peace. The old certainties trembled beneath the quiet insistence of truth. The man's legacy had not been wealth or lineage, but disturbance, the kind that forces the soul to reckon with itself. His life had become a parable, whispered across generations, that even the most fallen among us can awaken, and that awakening, though it burns, is the first breath of redemption. As years passed, the plantation became a ruin, overtaken by wildflowers, and people came to see it not as a relic of shame, but as a place of remembrance. They came to stand in the silence he had once endured, and to feel, if only for a moment, the gravity of human frailty and the possibility of change. The world beyond remained imperfect, forever caught between cruelty and grace, but in that place, something endured, a reminder that even in the darkest soil, light can take root. The moral rebirth of the world was not a blaze of glory, but a slow awakening, fragile, haunted, and unfinished. And perhaps that was the truest form of redemption, not the triumph of good over evil, but the courage to keep seeking goodness in the ruins left behind, emption itself.